I came across Big Fork Brands recently, and it's become one of those finds you actually want to tell people about, and you don't find that often. Okay. They're doing bacon sausage, plus these really solid pork jerky snacks and Chicago style sauces. Basically, upgrade anything you throw them on burgers, hot dogs, fries, throw it on there. It works.
But I bet it's packed full of junk.
Actually, it's made with clean ingredients and real care. That's small batch with no shortcuts, and people are obsessed with the flavor. You can go over to bigforkbrands.com, use our code INFOGO at checkout, and get 20% off anything on the site.
You can find the link and our code in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast. I'm William.
And I'm Kat,
And that makes this Info on the Go.
feeding your curiosity with every show.
All right, I'm just going to jump right in and set this one up. So imagine a place so remote that it feels untouched by time, a rugged volcanic island in the Galapagos, miles from the nearest comforts of civilization. Floreana Island is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. Fresh water is scarce, the land is harsh and dry.
Floriana Island is beautiful, but it is not forgiving. Fresh water is scarce, the land is harsh and dry. Survival depends on resilience, resourcefulness, and a willingness to endure isolation in its purest form.
And yet, in the early 1930s, a small group of people chose this place not as a refuge of a last resort, but as a deliberate escape. And they came seeking something better than the modern world they had left behind: freedom, simplicity, control over their own lives.
At first it was just one man and one woman. A German doctor, Friedrich Ritter, driven by philosophy and a deep rejection of modern society, and his partner, Dore Strauch, who followed him in search of healing and a new beginning.
Not long after that, they were joined by another pair, a married couple, Heinz Whitmore and Margaret Whitmore, who came not for the ideology, but for survival and opportunity. And for a brief moment, the island held a fragile balance between these very different visions of life.
And then she arrived. A woman calling herself a baroness, Eloise von Wagner Bosquet, bringing with her not just ambition but chaos. She didn't and she didn't even come alone, right? She brought men with her, lovers who orbited her influence, including Robert Philipson and Rudolf Lorenz. With her also came power struggles, jealousy, and a growing tension that the island could not contain. Now, what began as an experiment in freedom slowly shifted into something darker and very unstable. Because isolation doesn't just remove people from the world. Sometimes it reveals who they really are. 7 people came to this island chasing a new life.
Not all of them loved. On Floriana Island, the story really truly begins with just two people. So we kind of got to backtrack just a little bit. A man with a radical idea and a woman willing to risk everything to follow him. Friedrich Ritter was a German physician, but he was far more than a doctor. He was a philosopher. His philosophy was shaped by the unrest of post-World War I Europe, where many thinkers questioned whether modern civilization had become unstable, artificial, and morally exhausted.
Ritter was influenced by a blend of early 20th century philosophical ideas. He was anti modernist in thought, elements of naturalism, and a belief shared by some German intellectual circles that industrial society had weakened human resilience. He rejected urban life, modern medicine systems as he saw them, and the growing dependence on industrial comforts. To him, modern civilization did not elevate humanity, it softened it. His answer was not reform, it was an escape.
So by the late 1920s, Ritter had developed a personal philosophy of radical self reliance, right?
Mm.
That human beings could only be truly free and truly strong if they removed themselves entirely from modern systems, all the comforts that you get. He believed that isolation discipline, and physical hardship could strip away illusion and reveal what he considered authentic human existence. And this wasn't just survivalism, it was ideology purification.
And to test it, he chose one of the most remote inhabited regions on Earth, the Galapagos Archipelago. But belief alone wasn't enough to sustain him. When Ritter left Germany, he brought more than philosophy. He brought the practical foundations of a self made world. Among their limited supplies were essential medical tools from his background as a doctor, writing materials used to document his experiment, basic farming equipment, seeds for cultivation, and personal scientific instruments meant to help him measure and observe the environment. These were not luxuries. They were the scaffolding of his attempt to rebuild life from scratch.
He also brought intellectual intent. He planned to document the experiment as proof that a disciplined human being could survive and thrive without society. But there was one truth he could not escape. He was married. So Ritter left his wife behind in Germany to pursue this experiment, severing not only geography, but personal responsibility in the pursuit of ideology. He crossed from philosophy into, well, lived consequence.
But by his side was Dore Strauch, his partner, not his wife, a woman seeking both physical and emotional healing. Dore suffered from multiple sclerosis, and at the time she viewed the journey not as philosophical experimentation, but as a chance at renewal, stability, and escape from a body and life that had become increasingly difficult to manage. In Ritter, she saw structure, purpose, and direction. And in 1929, the two arrived on Floreana Island.
And they chose it because it represented everything they were trying to escape: distance from Europe, absence of government infrastructure, minimal population, and the psychological isolation needed to test their beliefs. If Ritter's philosophy was correct, then Floriana would strip life down to its essential truth.
And together they set out to create a life completely removed from the world they had left behind. Their goal was nothing short of radical: to survive and endure relying solely on their own labor, intellect, and physical resilience, building a self sufficient existence from volcanic rock, limited freshwater sources, and the unpredictable rhythms of the equatorial environment.
But Floriana was not a controlled experiment. Fresh water was scarce, often collected from natural rock basins and caves after rainfall. Soil quality, well, it varied dramatically, making farming, well, inconsistent. So the little bit of seeds they brought sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. The heat, humidity, and isolation created constant physical strain, and every necessity from food to shelter to tools, well, it had to be created, maintained, or repaired without external support. There were no safety nets, only consequences. For her to be dealing with multiple sclerosis and going through this without any kind of medicine or pain relief, like that's gonna be tough.
That doesn't sound like a good plan to me. Uh, but in that environment, personality really became fate. Ritter's presence dominated their world. He was disciplined, assertive, and uncompromising, shaping daily life around strict routines and philosophical principles. He dictated labor, controlled rationing, and treated survival itself as a form of moral and intellectual discipline.
Dora, by contrast, was physically weakened and increasingly dependent not only on Ritter's structure, but on the isolation that removed all other alternatives. So, what began as mutual escape gradually hardened into a closed system of reliance, where survival, ideology, and emotional dependence became, well, it just became a way of life. And together, they embodied a fragile equation.
A man trying to prove philosophy and a woman trying to survive within it. A balance between vision and vulnerability, strength and dependence, control and surrender. And it was a balance that isolation would slowly begin to distort. Years later, after Ritter's death on Floreana Island, Dora would leave and return to Germany, eventually publishing her account of their time there. Her writings would become one of the only first-hand records of the experiment, but even they would be shaped by memory, trauma, and the passage of time. Because from the very beginning, this was never just a story about survival. It was a story about philosophy turned into isolation, and what happens when ideas are forced to live inside of the real world.
Let's kind of jump around a little bit here. So now there's going to be two groups on Floriana Island. One is driven by ideas and the other by survival. The second group arrived in 1932, just a few years after Ritter and Dore had began their experiment. They were a married German couple, Heinz Whitmore and Margaret Whitmore. But unlike Ritter, they didn't come chasing philosophy. They came chasing a second chance.
Back in Germany, life in the early 1930s was unstable. The economy was struggling, opportunities were limited, and for many families, the future felt uncertain. The Whitmers were not idealists. They were practical people looking for a place where they could build something of their own. And then they heard about Ritter. Stories had begun to circulate, newspaper articles and word of mouth describing a German doctor living on a remote island in the Galapagos Islands, surviving off the land, free from the pressures of modern society. To some, it sounded extreme. To the Whitmers, it sounded like an opportunity. But their decision wasn't just bold, it was risky.
And they didn't arrive alone because Margaret was already pregnant. And Heinz brought along his son from a previous relationship, a young boy named Harry. They were not just starting over, they were bringing a family into one of the harshest environments imaginable. And when they arrived on Floriana, they entered a world already shaped by Ritter's presence. He had claimed intellectual ownership of the island experiment. Tensions existed almost immediately, not open conflict, but a quiet underlying friction between two very different visions of life.
Heinz was practical and reserved, focused on the essentials building shelter, securing food, creating stability, and Margaret was observant and resilient, quickly adapting to the island's rhythms while managing the realities of pregnancy and isolation. Where Ritter and Dora sought to prove a philosophical point, the Whitmers were trying to survive. And survive they did. They built a home, cultivated crops, and in time, Margaret gave birth on the island, one of the first recorded births on Floriana. Their settlement became structured, steady, and grounded in routine. But what made the Whitmers truly important wasn't just that they endured.
It was what they watched. They kept their distance from the others, avoiding unnecessary conflict and quietly observing the growing tensions between Ritter, Dore, and eventually the newcomers who would bring chaos to the island. Years later, Margaret Whitmore would become the primary storyteller of Floriana Mystery, publishing her account of what happened during those turbulent years. But like any story told by a survivor, her version really raises some important questions. Was she simply a witness, or was she closer to the truth than she ever admitted?
And after that, one woman arrived, and suddenly, life on Floriana Island wasn't just about survival anymore. It became about power, and that woman was Eloise von Wagner Bosquet, a striking, theatrical, and deeply controversial figure who claimed aristocratic status, though no records ever confirmed her title. Whether she was truly a baroness or simply invented the identity, one thing was certain she believed it.
And she arrived in 1932, the same years as the Whitmores. But unlike them, she didn't come quietly. She came to take over, with her two men bound tightly to her orbit. Robert Philipson, who was her primary lover, loyal, protective, and fully devoted to her authority, right? And then you had Rudolf Lorenz, by contrast, occupied a far more fragile position. He was insecure, often humiliated, and according to later accounts, subjected to both emotional and physical mistreatment. And this wasn't just a group, it was hierarchy. And at the top was the Baroness. First of all, there's all kind of different dynamics on this island now.
This is becoming a melting pot of something I wouldn't appreciate.
Yeah, I mean, they didn't have a skipper, they didn't have a Gilligan, a professor, or Marianne.
No, they had drama. She quickly established herself as the island's dominant personality, not through cooperation, but through force of will. She carried a pistol, wore dramatic clothing more suited to European society than a volcanic island, and spoke openly of her plans to transform Floriana into something extraordinary. Not a survival outpost, but a destination.
Yeah, she claimed she would build a luxury hotel complete with wealthy guests, passing yachts, and international attention. She told visitors elaborate stories, presenting herself as the ruler of the island, often exaggerating or outright inventing details about her life and authority. And people listened.
Passing sailors, journalists, and curious travelers began to stop at Floriana, not to see Ritter, not to see the Whitmers, but to see her. She became the face of the island, inserting herself into every narrative and reshaping the story to center around her persona. And for Ritter, this was infuriating.
He came to escape society, not to recreate it, and the Baroness represented everything he rejected: ego, performance, attention. Their conflict wasn't just personal, it was ideological. Two completely opposing versions of life forced into the same isolated space. And for the Whitmores, the situation was more dangerous than philosophical. It was unpredictable.
The Baroness and her companions were known to take supplies, interfere with property, and create tension that threatened the fragile balance of survival. Accusations of theft and sabotage began to circulate. Trust, which was already thin, started to erode completely, and within the Baroness's own group, cracks were forming. Philipson remained loyal. Lorenz did not.
Over time, Lorenz became more increasingly desperate. You got to think, he was isolated within his own group, fearful of Philipson and dependent on the Baroness, who seemed to alternate between control and cruelty. Eventually, he began seeking refuge with Whitmore's, quietly stepping outside the power structure that had once defined him. And that shift really mattered because now the island wasn't just divided into groups, it was unstable from within, from within groups. And by the time the tensions reached their peak, Floriana was no longer an experiment in freedom or even a test of survival. It had become something entirely different. It was a place of rivalries, of control, of fear. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back.
So by the early 1930s, roughly between 1932 and 34, life on Floriana Island had fully fractured. Three groups, seven people, and no realistic way to escape one another. What had begun as separate experiments in survival had hardened into factions, each shaped by personality, philosophy, and the brutal limitations of isolation on a volcanic island where fresh water was limited. Communication with the outside world was rare, and every supply depended on passing ships. The first group remained Friedrich Ritter and Dore Strauch, the original pair. By this point, their relationship had become increasingly strained under the weight of constant isolation. Ritter's rigid ideology and need for control shaped nearly every aspect of their existence, from daily labor to food restrictions, while Dore, physically weakened and emotionally dependent, struggled with the psychological pressure of life in total isolation.
What had once been a shared vision of freedom had become a closed system of endurance and tension. The second group, Heinz Whitmore and Margret Whitmore, they represented the opposite approach, where Ritter and Dora lived by ideology, the Whitmores lived by routine. They focused entirely on survival, building shelter from volcanic rock, cultivating crops in thin soil, collecting rainwater, and adapting to the island's harsh climate. Unlike the others, they did not attempt to reshape the island into an idea. They adapted themselves to it. Their family life, including the birth of their child, it all became a stabilizing force in an otherwise unstable environment.
But the most volatile presence was the third group. Eloise von Wagner Bosquet had arrived with Robert Philipson and Rudolf Lorenz, and together they transformed the island's fragile balance into something far more unstable. Unlike the other settlers, the Baroness did not settle into survival quietly. She performed it. She presented herself as aristocracy, claimed influence over the island, and spoke openly of ambitious plans that bore little connection to reality, including visions of transforming Floriana into a luxury destination for wealthy visitors. Now, these claims repeated to passing sailors and visitors, which drew attention to the island and unintentionally pulled the isolated community into contact with the outside world more frequently than before.
And you can imagine Ritter is probably just, I can see him steaming because he really wants control of what he set out to do.
Right.
Small disputes escalated into accusations. Supplies went missing, boundaries blurred, trust eroded, and Ritter viewed the Baroness a disruption to his experiment, a force of ego and chaos invading what he believed should be a disciplined existence. The Whitmores, meanwhile, saw something more immediate, instability. That threatened their ability to survive.
Now,
Mm.
within the Baroness's own group, fractures were also forming. Philipson remained closely loyal to her authority, while Lorenz, physically and emotionally weaker, became increasingly isolated, uncertain of his place in the hierarchy, and reportedly subjected to mistreatment. As these internal pressures mounted, the island itself became something far more dangerous than a collection of settlers. It became a closed system of competing realities.
Every group depended on the same limited land, the same scarce water, and the same unpredictable supply ships. Every disagreement was magnified by isolation. Every personality clash, it carried consequences. And slowly, without any single moment of collapse, the island shifted from experiment to pressure cooker, a place where survival, ideology, and ambition were no longer separate forces. They were colliding in real time.
Hey, William, before we get into the first disappearance, what do you say we take a break?
Absolutely. I'm ready.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Have you thought about what you're getting your mom for Mother's Day? At Cozy Earth, they have a full line of apparel, PJs, shirts, socks, you name it, they have it. And if you buy any of their bedding, they have a 100-night sleep trial and a 10-year warranty, free shipping on orders over $50 or more. And our listeners get an exclusive discount of 21% off just by using our code INFOGO at checkout. And you can do that at cozyearth.com. Find the link and the code in the show notes. If you're laying mulch, bedding animals, covering seeds, or just want your property looking right, there's one name you need to know. Irwin Farms, Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. When it comes to quality wheat straw, it matters. Clean, consistent, and ready to work because they don't cut corners, they bell it. Whether you're a homeowner, gardener, farmer, or you're just getting your hands dirty for the first time, they've got you covered. You can find the link in the show notes. Just Google Middle Georgia's #1 wheat straw provider. Either way, you'll find Irwin Farms.
Now that we're back, the turning point on Floreana Island came in 1934. By this point, the fragile balance between the island's three factions had already pretty much fractured, right? But nothing really prepared them for what happened next. Eloise von Wagner Bosquet, the dominant and theatrical figure who had reshaped life on the island through her sheer force of personality, vanished without warning.
Oh,
I'm sure to nobody else's displeasure.
oh yeah, I'm pretty sure of it. And with her disappearance, well, Robert Phillipson, her closest companion and most loyal supporter, there was no struggle reported, no confrontation witnessed, no clear sign of departure, only absence. According to the Whitmores, Heinz Whitmore and Margaret Whitmore, that is, the Baroness and Philipson had left the island aboard a passing yacht, supposedly bound for, well, Tahiti, because everybody wants to go to Tahiti. But it could have been, just to the mainland. Who knew? But the story fit her personality perfect. It was dramatic, abrupt, and attention grabbing to the very end. On the surface, well, it sounded plausible.
After all, small vessels did occasionally pass through the Galapagos chain, and informal travel between the islands was not unheard of in the 1930s. But almost immediately, problems appeared. No shipping records confirmed the arrival or departure of any yacht matching the description. No harbor logs, no customs documentation, no external witnesses from nearby islands corroborated the story. Even within the local maritime routes of the Galapagos Islands, there was no trace of the vessel the Whitmers described.
And,
So, the Whitmers.
but you got to think too, Robert, he was always close to her. And if he
Mm.
didn't report any kind of struggle or anything,
He could have been in on it. Who knows?
yeah, with the Whitmores, I mean, yeah, I mean, there's so many different angles here.
Hmm.
But the absence of evidence became its own kind of evidence. Suspicion spread quickly among the remaining settlers. Friedrich Ritter, well, he really viewed the explanation with skepticism, seeing it as inconsistent with the Baroness's previous behavior, someone who thrived on attention and control, not quiet disappearance. Others on the island began to question whether the story was being carefully shaped rather than truthfully told. Because if the yacht story was false, then something else had happened entirely. Competing theories, well, they began to circulate immediately.
Some believed she had staged her own escape, finally leaving behind an experiment that had turned hostile and unpredictable, by her undoing, from what we understand.
Absolutely.
So others suspected a more violent outcome, pointing to escalating tensions, supply disputes, and fractured relationships with their own group. Hmm. And some quietly wondered whether the truth had already been decided by whoever remained behind to tell the story. Meanwhile, the only remaining member of her group, Rudolf Lorenz, was left behind alone. Lorenz had always been the most vulnerable of the trio, dependent, unstable, and often positioned at the bottom of the group's internal hierarchy. Now, stripped of the Baroness's control, the Philipson and Philipson's protection, he became a solitary figure on an island that was already defined by isolation and mistrust.
What made his situation even more unsettling was what came next, because Lorenz didn't stay. Shortly after the Baroness's disappearance, well, he attempted to leave Floreana Island by boat, seeking passage to another island. But he too would vanish from the main settlement narrative, his journey ending far from where it began. His remains were later discovered on another island in a state of natural mummification, and one by one, the Baroness's group had been erased.
And with their disappearance, something fundamental shifted on the island. What had once been a tense experiment on isolation was now something far darker. A close circle of survivors, competing accounts, and unanswered questions were every explanation where. A close circle of survivors, competing accounts, and unanswered questions where every explanation raised more doubt than uncertainty. And for the first time, everyone remaining on the island understood the same unsettling truth. The island no longer simply tested survival. It decided who stayed and who disappeared.
So, with the Baroness and Philipson gone in 1934, attention on Floriana Island shifted immediately to the only remaining member of the group, Rudolf Lorenz. And Lorenz had always occupied the lowest position in the fragile hierarchy of the Baroness's circle, less confident, more dependent, and reportedly subject to emotional instability and mistreatment. In a place like Floriana, where isolation magnified every power imbalance, his weakness had always been visible to the other settlers on the island.
But after the disappearance, that weakness became something else. It became fear. Lorenz was now completely alone, stranded in a settlement where trust had already collapsed and where the fate of the two people had just become unanswered question. Whether he believed the Baroness had abandoned him or something worse had happened, he understood one thing clearly. He could not stay there.
So within days or weeks of the disappearance, Lorenz made the decision to leave Floriana Island. His plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in reality. He attempted to reach another inhabited island by a small boat and find passage back to civilization. The Galapagos chain, however, well, it's not that forgiving. The waters between islands are vast, unpredictable, and shaped by strong Pacific currents. Weather shifts quickly. Small craft are easily overwhelmed. Even experienced sailors treated inter-island travel with caution in the early 20th century, and Lorenz had none of those advantages.
None. Now, what exactly happened next depends on fragmented accounts. Some reports suggest he departed with a local fisherman who agreed to guide him partway. Others imply he left with limited supplies and minimal support, driven more by desperation than planning. What is known is that he never arrived safely at his intended destination. For a time, his fate remained uncertain, lost somewhere in the archipelago islands, storms and silence, where there were no immediate rescue reports, no confirmed sightings, and no coordinated search effort recorded from the isolated community on Floriana. Eventually, the mystery resolved itself in the most unfortunate way.
Because his body was discovered on another island in the Galapagos, naturally mummified by heat, salt air, and arid conditions. The environment had preserved him rather than destroyed him, turning the final chapter of his escape into something, well, eerie. There was no dramatic conclusion, only distance, only silence. With Lorenz gone, The last remaining trace of the Baroness's group had been erased from Floriana. No leader, no companions, no witnesses left, well, to speak of what truly happened inside that fractured circle.
And yet, their absence did not bring clarity. It really deepened the mystery, because each disappearance now stood alone, but also connected to everything that had come before it. And on the island, already defined by isolation, suspicion, and survival, that pattern was impossible to ignore. One by one, the people who challenged the island's fragile balance were gone, and nothing about it felt accidental anymore.
So let's get into the final tragedy on Floreana Island that struck sometime between the mid 1930s, most likely between 1934 and 1935. Friedrich Ritter, the man who had arrived years earlier with grand philosophical ambitions of escaping civilization and proving the power of self-sufficiency, died under circumstances that remain uncertain to this day.
Now, the official explanation given at the time was food poisoning. But even then, the account raised immediate doubts. Ritter had long adhered to a strict vegetarian diet, carefully controlling what he consumed and how it was prepared. Now, on an island where food preservation was extremely limited, no refrigeration, minimal medical supplies, and harsh environmental conditions, illness was always a risk. Contamination from spoiled produce, improperly stored food, or bacteria in scarce water sources was not uncommon.
Still, those who knew Ritter questioned that explanation. Suspicion quickly turned toward Dore, his longtime partner, because Dore had shared nearly every aspect of the island life with him: years of isolation, physical hardship, and psychological strain that had slowly worn both individuals in different ways. Their relationship, once rooted in shared ideals, it had become increasingly unstable over time. Dependence and resentment coexisted in a fragile balance, shared by consistent proximity and the absence of outside influence. First of all, she's battling multiple sclerosis. She has no medical care. Yeah, and I imagine at some point she probably wanted to leave. Now, I'm speculating here.
I mean, my speculation is that somebody on that island snapped. Now, either the Wittmers really wanted that island to themselves to raise their family on without, anybody else, or Doris
Uh,
Strout got jealous
I
and she poisoned his food.
I'm thinking that she didn't get jealous. I'm thinking the Whitmores, I think, just stayed out of it. I think Dora was ready to go home, and Ritter, being the controlling person he was, I think she probably may have done something, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, let's go on.
By the final months, accounts suggest that their life together had become strained, marked by exhaustion, emotional volatility, and the psychological pressure of prolonged isolation. Whether this created motive, coincidence, or nothing at all remains one of the central uncertainties of the story. Some later interpretations suggest Ritter's death may have been accidental, an unfortunate consequence of harsh living conditions, limited medical care, and environmental contamination. Others point to the emotional fractures within the household and question whether something more deliberate occurred in the final breakdown of their partnership. But no definitive evidence ever emerged, only interpretations and silence.
What is certain, though, is that Ritter's death marked the end of the original vision for life on Floriana Island. The philosophical experiment he had begun in 1929, rooted in rejection of modern society and belief in radical self-sufficiency, will it collapse not through external force, but through internal pressure, isolation, conflict, and the limits of human endurance. And in the aftermath, Dorstanch, well, eventually left the island and returned to Europe, later publishing her account of the experience. But like all firsthand narratives, it was shaped by survival and memory. Her version of events would be scrutinized, questioned, and debated. Because even with Ritter gone, clarity didn't arrive. Instead, what remained was something more unsettling: a pattern of disappearances, death, conflicting stories. No single explanation could fully contain. The man who came to escape civilization, well, he just didn't survive it. And in the end, He may not have survived the world he built inside it either.
Heck of a hubris in a real life story.
Yeah, for real. Mm.
In the aftermath of the disappearances, deaths, and unanswered questions, the only people left on Floreana Island were the Wittmers, the husband and wife who had never come to the island seeking ideology, attention, or escape from society. They'd just come to survive. And that difference, more than anything else, may have determined their fate. While others arrived with competing visions of how life should be, the Whitmers focused on how life was. They adapted quickly to the island's demands, securing reliable food sources, improving shelter against the harsh volcanic environment, managing water collection, and establishing routines that reduced uncertainty.
Where others clashed with the island, they adjusted to it. They also arrived at a crucial moment. By the time the tensions among the other settlers escalated, the Whitmers had already built a stable foundation, physical, emotional, and practical. And that allowed them to endure the increasing instability around them rather than be consumed by it. And perhaps, most importantly, they just kept their distance.
They were present for the conflicts, the rivalries, and the growing mistrust between the groups, but they did not fully participate in the ideological struggles that defined the others. That separation gave them something rare on Floriana perspective. And over time, as the other settlers disappeared or died under uncertain circumstances, the Whitmers became the last standing witnesses to everything that had unfolded on the island.
And years later, after leaving Floriana, Margaret Whitmore would publish her account of life there, helping to shape much of what is known today about the events of the 1930s. Her testimony became the foundation for nearly every retelling of the Floriana story that followed. But like all survivor accounts, it carries an unavoidable complexity. Memory is not neutral. It's shaped by fear, time, trauma, and the need to make sense of chaos. What is remembered, what is emphasized, and what is left out, that can really shift the story in a subtle but, well, meaningful way. And in a place like Floriana, where few outside records exist, well, those shifts really do matter in this story.
Because in the absence of competing witnesses, one version of events becomes history, even if questions remain. The Whitmers survived, but survival itself does not answer the central mystery of Floriana. It only ensures that someone lived long enough to tell the story. And the story they told is both our greatest source of truth and our final reminder of uncertainty. 7 people arrived on the island seeking entirely different futures. Only 2 remained to describe what happened. And even now, decades later, Floriana refuses to give up its secrets. Not because the story is lost, but because some places do not preserve answers. They preserve questions.
Did Philipson do something to the baroness? Was Orans involved? Was his body placed on another island? Was Ritter poisoned? We'll really never know. Were the Whitmers involved? I don't
Right.
know.
But that can't be the reason for guilt either.
No, true. You know what? I say let's lighten this episode up before we end it. What do you think?
Sounds good.
Let's do some Floriana Island facts.
Yes. Floriana Island is one of the smaller islands in the Galapagos archipelago, which is roughly 26 square kilometers in area. It sits about 60 kilometers or 37 miles southeast of Santa Cruz Island, surrounded by turquoise waters and dramatic cliffs.
Sounds beautiful. Unique wildlife. The island is home to the endemic species, including the Floriana mockingbird and unique sea lion colonies. It also has a nesting site for green sea turtles, Galapagos penguins, one of the few penguin species found near the equator. Wow, that's intriguing.
Factoid. The post office barrel. In 1793, the first settlers on Floriana established a barrel post office, which allowed passing ships to drop mail without a formal postal system. Now, today, the famous barrel still exists, and visitors can leave and pick up mail, making it a quirky piece of living history.
It would be worth it just to go there to use the post office barrel.
Mm-hmm.
Floriana is mostly volcanic in origin, with rugged lava fields, volcanic craters, and, well, limited fresh water sources. This harsh terrain, well, it contributed to the challenges the early settlers faced.
The island has a long history of dramatic visitors, including whalers, pirates, and later European settlers seeking isolation, which really set the stage for the 1930s utopian experiments that we've been talking about.
So, endangered species on the Floriana Islands, some species like the giant Galapagos tortoise, Floriana, well, they have gone extinct due to human activity. But conservation efforts now protect the remaining wildlife there.
Well, that's kind of sad.
It's not kind of sad, it is sad.
You know, but what about tourism? Floriana is visited by adventurous travelers looking for history, snorkeling, and wildlife. Sites like Devil's Crown, a volcanic reef, are renowned for snorkeling with tropical fish, sea turtles, and hammerhead sharks.
And then you have legendary myths, because every place has to have legendary myths, right? The island has inspired myths and stories over centuries, including tales of phantom ships, missing settlers, strange lights, perfect for the eerie Florana narrative, because the baroness, she's said to still walk the beaches.
Oh. Now, the island's very first known resident was an Irishman, Patrick Watkins, who survived on Floriana from 1807 to 1809, growing vegetables to trade with passing whalers. There is a tiny community still on Floriana today. Only about 100 to 160 people live on the island, most making a living through farming or small-scale tourism.
Floriana still relies on natural freshwater ponds that fill only in the rainy season. So, water shortages can still be a serious challenge for the residents there. I think I want to go visit Floriana.
Me too.
Man, that map is getting big.
It is. We have lots of places to
Yeah,
go.
lots.
And we're not getting any younger.
I'm definitely not getting any younger.
Mm-mm. If you would like to support this podcast, tell a friend and help get the word out.
If you would like to help us keep the show going, you can do so by checking out some of our sponsors or at Patreon. Either way, those links are in the show notes.
And as always, William and I want to thank you for listening.
Whether you just tuned in or been with us from day one, thank you, the listener.
You can join the Facebook group at Info on the Go
Over there, you can share with us your show ideas.
or ask us a question.
But whatever you do, stop right now and hit that follow button wherever you're listening to this podcast.
Send us a text using the link in the show notes or leave a review.
Leaving that review really does help that algorithm help others find us. But if you would like to email Kat and I directly,
you can do so at infoonthegopodcast@gmail.com.
and that link is in the show notes. Till next time.
Stay curious.
If your stomach's been off lately, like bloating, reflux, or just not feeling right, there's a simpler way to get back on track.
With Professor B's Digestive Aid, which is an all-natural blend of pure honey and ancient apitherapy, a herb rooted in Roman tradition. You know how at least they had some things right? It's designed to gently support and balance your digestion.
No long ingredient list, no harsh additives, just two powerful, time-tested ingredients working together. It's even the same formula used to help cancer patients manage digestive discomfort.
And right now, you can get an exclusive 10% off any product. Just use our code INFOGO at checkout.